return later on when I start a little discussion on climate change adaptation. And here's the key finding from the Durban +5 meeting. Climate change clearly has serious implications for many protected areas, and in fact is the major overarching issue confronting protected areas in the 21st century globally. So in summary, there's been considerable progress in different aspects, but still protected areas face daunting challenges, and they still have, unfortunately, a very long way to go to realize their effectiveness and also to contribute to the conservation agenda and to sustainable development. So we're at a very important point in time for protected areas. It's a crossroads where some basic decisions have to be made. From the CBD COP9, again, one success was the establishment of criteria, finally, for the definition of protected areas in the high seas outside of territorial jurisdiction. And again, it was underlined that there is a fundamental need for increased research into the role of protected areas in climate change adaptation strategies. So this provides a transition into this very important subject area, which again has been recognized as the fundamental issue confronting protected areas globally: climate change and its impacts. I think it's beyond doubt already that climate change impacts are evident. In fact, there has been one species already that apparently went into extinction and has the dubious honor of being the first one that went into extinction strictly because of climate change impacts. Protected areas, again, we heard islands, we heard networks, we heard the need for connectivity. Well, protected areas are not luxuries. They're not something that was set aside 100 years ago because there was lots of land to set aside. And they're still there, performing conservation functions, but protected areas are social constructs. They're dynamic. What was needed 100 years ago is not necessarily what is required today out of protected areas. They have to adapt to the context, to the changing circumstances, to the pressures and the drivers affecting them. And climate change certainly is one of those major ones. It would not be stretching it too far, in my opinion, that protected areas are the best insurance that we can have to ensure any kind of sustainable future. And the perception of protected areas has to change radically. They are not areas set aside for research or recreation or heritage value conservation. Yes, they are, but that is not the only reason for having them. They are the fundamental anchors around which a more sustainable landscape, which translates into a more sustainable future, more sustainable economy, more sustainable society, can actually be based upon. They are key ingredients for sustainability. As I mentioned, protected areas are already being noticeably affected by climate change impacts. For example, mountainous areas, we hear about the glaciers melting. We see the retreat of snowpack. Alpine meadows also coming under extreme threat. Marine areas with coral bleaching, and coastal and drylands. Parks Canada, an agency with which I worked quite a while ago, for quite a while, recently undertook an assessment at the national system level of the implications of climate change to Canada's national parks. And it was found that under all climate projections and scenarios, more than half of all existing national parks in Canada will experience quite substantial vegetation change. So that has severe implications for management planning, for the setting of objectives for which the protected area is established. How do you pursue these objectives? What are you managing for? It becomes a very fundamental question. And in the United Kingdom, it is estimated that approximately 10% of reserves, given current trends, could be lost in 30 to 40 years. Lost in the sense of their conservation value being completely degraded. Some vulnerability characteristics of protected areas are up here. I will not go through them all, realizing how much time there is left. This presentation will be available. This is based on a survey of literature over the last little while, and that body of literature is growing considerably. Again, on the bottom, those protected areas that have low management capacity and effectiveness today already clearly will be extremely vulnerable. Areas that have species at the edges of the ranges are very homogeneous, small in size, isolated from supporting ecological processes in the buffer zone or in the adjacent areas. They're vulnerable. Some of the implications then are that conservation effectiveness is threatened. The role of protected areas has to be re-examined as well. This must be recognized, and it has to be acted upon now. Like postponing it 5 or 10 or 20 years will certainly exacerbate the situation to the point where doing anything constructive and adaptive will become even that much more difficult. And whatever has to be conserved will certainly not be there, in part. So what can be done about it? That's the basic question. We talk about climate change adaptation, protected areas. It's a big threat, okay? We can agree on that. But what can we do about it? Given our current resourcing levels, given our state of knowledge, etc. Well, in the literature, there's considerable debate about this as well. But basically, what's provided in the literature can be broken down and presented in 2 categories: basic adaptation principles, as well as specific actions which can be undertaken by individual protected areas or the system, the national system of protected areas, starting today. First of all, of course, the principle is that you have to be proactive. You have to adapt. You have to anticipate, not react. This will save a lot of grief, a lot of unnecessary resource wastage. Be creative, be imaginative. Another principle is that ecosystem resilience, or the ability to bounce back from perturbation, has to be maximized as much as possible. Fragmentation and the creation of connectivity, as well as porosity or permeability in the landscape, has to be pursued as well in order to provide for corridors for species distribution, etc. Of course, porosity and permeability of landscapes is very difficult to achieve because there's so much physical infrastructure in place already. Roads, railways, towns, cities, etc. So in local communities and stakeholders clearly have to be involved in a very effective manner, because protected areas, like we're shifting from a model of them as with clearly defined boundaries to becoming more or less conservation zones. So their sphere of influence is expanding, and that's why buffer zone management becomes more important as well. Some things not to do as well. Some people propose to move protected areas in anticipation of what the climate change scenario predicts the landscape will look like, let's say, in 50 years. Well, that's something to be avoided at all costs, because it sets a very dangerous precedent, and no